Elemental gauge theory. Just saying the phrase might elicit a negative response. It might make you think of intimidating calculus involved with things like thermodynamics, but it's actually far simpler to understand than the impression the name gives the mechanic. Today, we're going to go down a list of things you need to know about elemental gauge to get the most out of your teams, from least dank to most dank. And hopefully, along the way, you may just find it's not as dank as you might think. So let's get started. The very first thing we need to talk about are auras and triggers. Now, that might beg the question, what are auras and triggers? I'm glad you asked. It's pretty simple. An aura is the first element applied to an enemy. If it has an infused element, like slimes, the aura will be that element. If it isn't, it's the first element you apply to an enemy. Note that Anemo and Geo from characters never exist as auras. You can tell what auras are on an enemy based on the symbol above them, or on their health bar, if they've got one. A trigger is the second element applied. When an element is applied to an enemy with an aura, it will trigger a reaction based on what element was the aura and what element was the trigger. Another note, whether a character is on or off field makes no difference here. If an off-field unit applies an element to an enemy with no aura, it will become one. If an off-field unit applies an element to an enemy with an aura, it will trigger a reaction. The same for off-field. The reaction is always based on the stats of the character's ability that triggered the reaction. Now, one thing you'll notice is that sometimes when a reaction is triggered, the enemy will still have an aura on them. This is where we get into our first important aspect of gauge theory, forward and reverse reactions. Forward and reverse are shorthand ways to describe how much of an aura, the gauge, is removed from an enemy after a reaction. Every time you apply an element to an enemy, it applies a certain amount of that element. When you trigger a reaction, sometimes only half of that amount gets through. This is called a reverse reaction. The way I like to think about it is like hearts in Zelda or Minecraft. Some things will cause you to lose more than one heart, a whole heart, or half a heart. Some elements are just better at taking hits from certain other elements, or better at consuming other elements. Specifically, the reactions with the reverse mechanic are melt with cryo, vaporize with pyro, bloom with hydro, crystallize, and swirl. On the other end, we have forward reactions. These reactions apply twice the amount of the trigger element to the aura. The forward reactions are melt with pyro, vaporize with hydro, and bloom with dendro. Other than that, there are reactions that react neutrally, simply applying the full amount. These reactions are overloaded, superconduct, frozen, and quicken. This means in most cases, there will either be a lingering aura for a short period of time, or the aura will be completely consumed after a reaction. Notice I said most cases. That brings us to the next aspect of gauge theory, gauge units. Gauge units are the amount of an element a specific ability applies. This is the part where we have to get into some numbers, but don't worry, practically speaking, it all comes down to how many reactions you can trigger on a certain aura. Most of the time, it's going to be 1 unit or 1 U. When 1 U of an element is applied to an enemy without an aura, it will become an aura and lose 0.2 U as a result, leaving 0.8 gauge units of that aura on the enemy. If, then, we apply another element, it will remove an amount of that aura depending on which type of reaction it triggered. Say we apply Pyro to an enemy with a 1U ability. That enemy now has a 0.8U aura. If we then apply 1U of Cryo, because Cryo on Pyro is a reverse reaction, it will remove half of that from the aura, leaving us with 0.23U. That allows us to apply Cryo again to trigger another melt. We remove another 0.5U, since that's more than the amount of Pyro left on the enemy, the aura is consumed with the second melt. Similarly, if we apply 1 unit of Hydro, because Hydro on Pyro is forward, it removes 2U from the enemy. That's more than what's on the enemy, so the aura is consumed with that single application. If instead we apply Electro, since Overload is neutral, it removes 1U. That's more than what's on the enemy, so the aura is consumed. Now imagine instead we applied 2U as an aura. Because for every gauge unit, 0.2U is expended to become an aura, the enemy would have 1.6U of Pyro. Now, since Overload is neutral, 1 unit of Electro will leave us with 0.6U of the Pyro aura, allowing us to get a second Overload. 1 unit of Hydro still removes twice the amount, or 2U. That's more than 1.6U, so we still only get 1 Vape. Finally, 1 unit of Cryo removes 0.5U. One application takes us down to 1.1U. Another application takes us down to 0.6U, and the last one removes the aura. That's weird, right? There should still be 0.1U to allow us to get a 4th melt. That takes us to our next section, Decay Rates on auras. You may have noticed before that if you hit an enemy with an elemental attack, the aura on the enemy eventually vanishes. That's because once an element is applied, the amount of it slowly decays over time. So in our previous example, at the same time we were removing 0.5U from the Pyro aura, the Pyro aura was getting weaker all on its own. By the time we did the 3rd melt, the decay had caused the amount of aura left on the enemy to be less than the 0.6U we had assumed. Once that amount gets to 0.5U, the next 0.5U removed by the Cryo consumes the remaining aura. One interesting note is that the higher the gauge of the ability that created the aura, the faster it decays. An aura created by a 1 unit ability will fully decay on its own after 9.5 seconds. So you would think that our 2U of Pyro earlier would decay after twice that, or 19 seconds. However, it actually fully decays after 12. Fortunately, we can cheat the system a little bit if we want that 19 seconds with anything but Pyro. Every other element that can exist as an aura has a mechanic called Decay Rate Inheritance. This is kind of like a secret reaction between abilities of the same element with different gauges. We can demonstrate this with a character like Kokomi. Her burst applies 2U, so normally the aura would decay after 12 seconds. But if we use a normal attack that applies 1U beforehand, when we burst, it will inherit the decay rate of the normal attack and will now last for 19 seconds. One way you can take advantage of this is with Nahida. If you normal attack before doing her skill, her 1.5U skill will inherit the decay rate of her normal attack, allowing it to decay slower. This can help a tiny bit with maintaining a Dendro aura long enough for her skill to tick again and refresh it. Generally speaking though, the cases where you can actually take advantage of it are kind of niche because, well, you typically want abilities that are used as auras to tick again. That brings us to the last and arguably most important bit of elemental gauge for this video, application rate. Wait a minute, I thought you said least stink to most stink. Everyone knows what application rate is. Did I just say I wouldn't be so sure? At least in my opinion, I think application rate is probably the most misunderstood mechanic in the game. To give you an example, think about the discussions you've seen where players talk about a character's application rate being good or bad. Do you think every player that's ever talked about application rate has a solid understanding of everything else we've talked about today? It's probably only a fraction of them, right? Whether the rate of a character's elemental application is good or bad is entirely dependent on those factors. Is the application being used as an aura or a trigger? If it's an aura, how many reactions can we get out of it before needing to refresh it? How quickly will the aura deplete? If it's a trigger, how many times can I apply the element before the aura is gone? How do I prevent it from becoming an aura? Application rate takes all the things we've talked about today and squares the complexity by adding an extra dimension to our calculations. changes over time between two rates of application. We can't simply look at a character that applies an element every 2 seconds and make a determination of the quality of that application. It's entirely dependent on the other elements in the mix, the abilities applying those elements, and how quickly that element is being applied. If, for instance, you wanted to melt a cryo ability that applies 1 unit of cryo every second, we know because of elemental gauge that it can remove 1 unit of pyro after 2 seconds. So in order to consistently melt that ability, our 1 unit of pyro application needs to be some amount faster than every 2 seconds in order for our cryo ability to consistently melt it. An ability's rate of application is called its internal cooldown, or ICD. Most abilities have what's referred to as standard ICD. With standard ICD, once an element is applied to an enemy, a timer starts for that enemy. The element cannot be applied to that enemy again by that ability until one of 2 conditions are met. The ability has done 3 instances of elemental damage, or 2.5 seconds have passed since the initial instance of application. An easy way to see this is by using catalyst users to attack infused enemies with normal attacks. You'll see the first hit will react, but your second won't. Both are doing electro damage, but your application for that enemy is on cooldown. Note that cooldowns are counted independently between enemies. If we take the same scenarios before, but with 2 different enemies, our second normal attack will still cause a reaction if it hits the second enemy. Non-standard ICDs are generally reserved for elemental abilities that hit very fast, and will normally just rely on a timer. However, it's still counted separately between enemies. There are also units with abilities that have no ICD. That means every time the ability makes contact with an enemy, it applies the element. For units that only get a couple of instances of application per rotation, this is kind of necessary. But for everyone else, it is incredibly overpowered, and one of the main reasons why every character released gets judged by how well they work with Zhengling. Generally speaking, units with very fast application are better served as auras because it may be difficult to apply enough of another element fast enough to maintain an aura for the fast ability to react with. Units with slower application are usually better served as triggers. The more gauge a unit applies with each application, the slower it may need to be to maintain an aura. The more gauge applied for a trigger, the faster your auras will need to be to make up for that. For triggers and amplifying reactions, we also need to consider the base damage of those abilities applying the element. The slower the application is, the higher the base damage, and the base damage of the abilities providing the aura needs to be to make up for that. Because of this, no unit can strictly be said to have bad application. It's entirely dependent on the team they're being placed in, and for slow appliers, whether their damage and the damage of their teammates makes up for their slow application. On top of that, there are special auras and compound auras and compounding decay rates that, depending on gauge and special reaction priorities, may or may not allow for several reactions to be triggered at once, but that is a whole can of worms that takes everything we've talked about today and is like, hey baby, let me tell you about cubic functions that would literally double the length of this video to give you any useful information on how to use it in team building to take advantage of. And I just CBA right now. This is enough of an introduction to give you the knowledge necessary to start theorizing ways you can build your teams for certain characters to enable or perform certain reactions. So just get out there, mess around with some things, see what you can do to maintain auras for other elements to react with, and have fun with the whole new world the basic knowledge of elemental gauge brings to team building. Helps troubleshoot any problems you might encounter along the way, and also subscribe. Was that a good sentence? No, that was probably not a good sentence. But hey, I'm a partner now, so I kind of feel obligated to force that down your throat at some point. I guess I'm technically an employee now, so allow me to do my job of keeping you on the platform by giving you all a pretty strong hint of what to do next. Let's hope it works. Bye.